The wind moves through canvas that should have rotted away decades ago. In the Darien Gap where Panama bleeds into Colombia, a tent still stands, its fabric sun-bleached to the color of bone. Inside, 3 sleeping bags lie arranged in a perfect row, as if their occupants simply stepped outside for a moment and never came back. But that moment was in 1973, 50 years of jungle reign, and somehow those sleeping bags remain, waiting. Halfway around the world, in the Taklamakan Desert, Chinese archaeologists stumbled upon a different kind of remnant in 2007. A circle of equipment cases, expensive and military grade, arranged around a collapsed satellite communications array. The sand had tried to claim it all, but the metal persisted. What made their discovery unsettling wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. No bodies, no bones, just equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, abandoned as if it had suddenly become worthless compared to something else. Something that called them away into the dunes. These are not isolated incidents. They are not the reckless vanishing acts of fortune hunters or naive adventurers stumbling into dangerous terrain. They represent something far more disturbing, a pattern that stretches back through centuries and crosses every continent where human ambition has dared to tread. The question is not whether people disappear. People disappear every day, claimed by nature's indifference or their own miscalculation. The question that should trouble us, the question that will follow us through every account we examine is this: what could possibly drive experienced explorers, people who understood survival and danger intimately, to abandon everything they knew, everything they were, and walk willingly into oblivion? The answer, whispered in 5 separate expeditions across different eras, is perhaps the oldest human obsession: eternal life, the promise of it, the madness of pursuing it, the terrible price of getting close. 5 expeditions, 5 different centuries, from the 1500s to the 21st century. 5 sets of experienced professionals, equipped with the best resources of their respective ages. Scientists who understood the scientific method. Military personnel trained to survive hostile environments. Explorers who had returned successfully from dozens of previous journeys. These were not amateurs. These were not dreamers with more hope than sense. And yet they vanished, every one of them, chasing legends of the fountain of youth across jungles, deserts, mountains, and islands that seemed to exist just beyond the edge of every map. In some cases, we found pieces of them, remains that posed more questions than they answered. A femur, carbon dated to match a missing expedition member, discovered 30 miles from where any logical search pattern would have looked. A skull, inexplicably preserved, found clutched in the roots of a tree that shouldn't have been able to grow in that particular soil. And journals, God help us, journals with final entries that read like fever dreams or confessions written by people no longer entirely human. One entry, recovered from a waterproof case in the Amazon basin, written by a botanist with 3 decades of field experience, contained only this line repeated 47 times. The water remembers what we've forgotten, and now it's teaching us to forget what we remember. Another, found in a cave system in Guatemala, described something the writer called the singing, a sound that apparently came from underground water sources and contained patterns older than language, but newer than silence. These were not the ravings of unprepared minds breaking under stress. These were intelligent, educated individuals who had survived harsher conditions before. Something out there, something connected to these searches for eternal life, changed them, broke them, or transformed them into something that could no longer return to the world they'd left behind. We tend to dismiss such stories as cautionary tales about obsession, about the dangers of wanting too much. But that dismissal is too comfortable, too easy. It lets us sleep at night because it places the blame on human weakness, rather than on the possibility that some pursuits awaken things that should remain sleeping. Over the coming examination, we will walk through each disappearance chronologically. We will start in 1523 with Ponce de Leon's final expedition, the one that history barely remembers because it was technically a failure. We will move through the centuries, tracking expeditions that official records barely acknowledge, following the thread that connects Victorian scientists to Cold War military units, to modern research teams backed by billionaire funding. And as we move through these accounts, we will begin to see the pattern. Not the pattern of human ambition, we already know that story. But the pattern in the locations they chose, the similar experiences they reported before contact ceased, the strange consistency in how their final camps were found, arranged almost ritualistically, as if they had prepared for a journey they could only take by leaving everything physical behind. The pattern suggests something waiting, something patient, something that has learned over centuries how to call to us in the voice of our deepest longing. The promise of eternal life, it seems, requires eternal disappearance. This is not a story about treasure hunting gone wrong. This is an investigation into 5 moments when the barrier between myth and reality became dangerously thin, when experienced professionals stopped trusting their training and started trusting something else, something that spoke to them from springs and pools and underground rivers, something that promised them forever but delivered only absence. The truth, as we will discover, is more terrifying than random tragedy could ever be, because random tragedy is impersonal, indifferent. But these disappearances, these 5 expeditions spanning 5 centuries, suggest something that is neither impersonal nor indifferent. They suggest something that watches, that waits, that calls out to those who come looking for it with just the right mixture of knowledge and desperation. They suggest that the fountain of youth might be real, and that its waters exact a price we cannot begin to comprehend until we're already paying it. The expeditions didn't fail to find what they were looking for. That's what makes this so terrifying. They succeeded, and success meant vanishing so completely that even their bones tell confused stories. So we begin with a simple premise that will grow increasingly complex and disturbing. 5 expeditions went looking for eternal life. 5 expeditions found something, and whatever they found, it made returning impossible. The oldest surviving maps of the ancient world contain something peculiar. Scattered across parchment depicting unknown territories and uncharted seas, cartographers marked specific locations with symbols denoting eternal youth. These weren't decorative flourishes or mythological embellishments. They were serious notations, placed alongside verified landmarks, major cities, and documented trade routes. The waters of immortality sat on these maps with the same authority as Rome or Constantinople, treated not as legend but as undiscovered fact waiting to be claimed. The first written account comes from Herodotus, the father of history himself, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era. In his extensive chronicles of the Persian Wars, he documented something the Macrobians of Ethiopia possessed, a fountain whose waters granted extraordinary longevity. According to his sources, these people routinely lived well beyond 100 years, maintaining strength and vitality that defied everything the Greeks understood about human aging. Herodotus described how Persian spies sent to investigate returned with accounts of water so light and pure that nothing would float in it, and anyone who bathed in these waters emerged with skin gleaming like oil, carrying the scent of violets. What made this account dangerous was its source. Herodotus wasn't recording campfire tales from wandering storytellers. He was compiling intelligence reports from Persian military expeditions, cross-referencing testimony from merchants who traded along African routes, building a historical record that subsequent generations would treat as fact. When he described the Macrobian fountain, he embedded it within paragraphs detailing verified geography, documented customs, and political structures that later explorers confirmed. The Fountain of Youth appeared in his text with the same evidentiary weight as everything else, impossible to dismiss without dismissing his entire historical method. The legend spread through every culture that followed, but it evolved in a disturbing way. Each civilization that encountered the story added their own documentation, their own eyewitness accounts, building layers of credibility that made skepticism seem naive. Alexander the Great's campaigns through Asia generated reports of a river in India, whose waters restored youth. His historians claimed that Alexander himself sought these waters, dedicating resources and troops to the search. Medieval scholars pored over these accounts, finding no reason to doubt them. If Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, believed these waters existed, who were they to question? The medieval period transformed these ancient accounts into cartographic fact. Mappe Mundi, the great world maps created by European monasteries, designated specific locations for the fountain. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1280, marked the fountain's location in India with the same precision used for Jerusalem or Paradise. The Ebstorf map, even larger and more detailed, showed the fountain in the Far East, surrounded by detailed notes about its properties. These weren't fantastic bestiaries or allegorical drawings. They were serious attempts to map reality, created by the most educated men in Christendom, consulted by kings and popes planning crusades and expedition. What happened next reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature. The fountain legends didn't fade as knowledge expanded. Instead, they intensified, corrupting some of the most rational minds in history. Alchemists, the forerunners of modern chemistry, devoted entire careers to recreating the fountain's waters in their laboratories. These weren't superstitious peasants or uneducated mystics. They were learned men, fluent in multiple languages, versed in mathematics and natural philosophy, conducting systematic experiments with reproducible methods. Yet they sincerely believed they could distill immortality from mercury, sulfur, and the philosopher's stone. Their laboratory notebooks survive, preserved in archives across Europe. The meticulous records reveal minds trapped between empirical observation and obsessive desire. They documented failures with scientific precision, adjusted their methods, tried again. One alchemist working in Prague during the 1400s recorded over 3,000 separate experiments attempting to create aqua vitae, the water of life. Each failure drove him not to abandon the quest, but to refine his approach. His final entry, written in a shaking hand, expressed absolute certainty that he stood on the verge of success, just one more attempt away from eternal youth. He died that winter, his formula incomplete. This obsession reached its apex during the Age of Exploration, when the legend migrated from laboratory to expedition charter. The indigenous Taino people of the Caribbean possessed their own stories of restorative waters. Myths woven through generations about sacred springs that healed the sick and restored vitality to the elderly. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, desperate for any advantage that might justify their brutal campaigns, these stories merged catastrophically with European legends. Juan Ponce de Leon, governor of Puerto Rico, heard these tales from Taino informants around 1512. The accounts varied, but they consistently described a land to the north called Bimini, where remarkable waters flowed. Some versions claimed these waters merely healed diseases. Others insisted they reversed the aging process itself. Ponce de Leon, approaching 60 and feeling mortality's approach, found himself caught between dismissing the stories as primitive superstition and recognizing their disturbing similarity to accounts he'd read in classical texts. Here's what made his decision genuinely tragic. Ponce de Leon was not a foolish man. He was an experienced administrator and military commander, someone who'd successfully governed territories and managed complex political situations. He understood the dangers of pursuing phantoms into unknown territory. Yet the official charter for his 1513 expedition, preserved in the Spanish archives at Seville, explicitly mentions investigating reports of rejuvenating waters. The Spanish crown, advised by the most educated minds in Europe, approved funding for this objective. They wrote it into official documents, assigned resources, expected results. The expedition discovered Florida, but Ponce de Leon never found his fountain. What he did find suggests something darker than simple failure. His men encountered springs throughout the territory, each time experiencing a surge of hope that this might be the legendary source. Native guides, recognizing what the Spaniards sought, led them to various water sources, sometimes sincerely trying to help, sometimes deliberately misleading the invaders. The psychological toll on the expedition members became severe. Men began seeing properties in ordinary water that weren't there, convincing themselves they felt younger, stronger, restored. The power of belief transformed normal springs into potential fountains of youth. Contemporary letters from expedition members reveal the corrosive effect this obsession had on rational thought. One soldier wrote home, describing how a particular spring made his joints feel less stiff, interpreting normal hydration and rest as evidence of age reversal. Another claimed his gray hair showed hints of returning to its original color after bathing in a certain stream, a detail his commanding officer noted in his own report, adding credibility to the claim. These men weren't lying. They genuinely believed what they reported, their perception warped by desperate hope and cultural conditioning that assured them such waters must exist. The pattern repeated across continents. Every major exploration of the 1500s and 1600s included some mention of seeking waters of youth or health. When Francisco Vasquez de Coronado explored what would become the American Southwest, starting in 1540, his official objectives included investigating reports of 7 golden cities, but his private correspondence reveals equal interest in indigenous stories of life-extending springs. Sir Walter Raleigh's expeditions to South America in the late 1500s sought El Dorado, but his writings show he also pursued reports of a lake whose waters granted longevity. These weren't side quests or romantic diversions. They appeared in formal expedition charters, budget requests submitted to monarchs, official reports filed with trading companies and colonial offices. The administrative apparatus of European expansion, the bureaucratic machinery that conquered continents, treated the Fountain of Youth as a legitimate objective worth pursuing with public funds. The intellectual establishment didn't discourage this. They encouraged it, citing classical sources, theological arguments about paradise, reports from previous expeditions. The psychological mechanism at work becomes clear when examining these documents. The fountain legend offered something uniquely seductive, a solution to humanity's fundamental problem packaged as a geographic discovery. Death, the one certainty that haunts every human consciousness, could potentially be conquered not through spiritual transcendence or moral virtue, but through simple location. Find the right place, drink the right water, live forever. The appeal bypassed rational analysis and struck directly at the deepest human fear. This helps explain why intelligent, educated, accomplished people suspended their skepticism. The alternative meant accepting death's inevitability, acknowledging that all human achievement ultimately ends in decay. The fountain legend offered escape, and the evidence seemed substantial. Classical historians had documented it. Medieval scholars had mapped it. Contemporary explorers kept reporting new leads. Each generation's failure to find the fountain didn't disprove its existence. It merely meant the search hadn't expanded far enough. By the 1700s, the legend had evolved again. The explicit search for immortality faded from official documents, but the underlying obsession persisted in new forms. Explorers sought the Northwest Passage, the source of the Nile, the interior of unmapped continents, always with the unspoken hope that somewhere in these blank spaces on the map, something existed that could transcend human limitations. The Fountain of Youth had become a template, a pattern of thinking that insisted mysterious places held transformative power. What makes this historical record genuinely disturbing is its breadth. This wasn't a localized superstition or a culture-specific myth. The fountain legend appeared independently across African, Asian, European, and indigenous American traditions. Each culture developed its own version, located it in their own unknown territories, sent their own seekers to find it. The universal human fear of death generated universal stories of escape, and these stories shared enough common elements that when cultures encountered each other, they recognized the same essential legend wearing different clothes. This multicultural foundation created a reinforcing cycle. When Spanish explorers heard Taino fountain stories, they didn't dismiss them as foreign superstition because they matched their own European legends too closely. When European alchemists read Arabic texts describing similar quests, they saw confirmation rather than coincidence. The legend fed on itself, growing stronger with each cross-cultural validation, accumulating credibility from sheer geographic and temporal spread. Understanding this history becomes essential because the pattern never truly ended. The explicit search for fountains of youth may have faded from official expedition charters, but the underlying psychology remained unchanged. Modern wellness industries, anti-aging research, and life extension movements all follow the same template. The belief that somewhere, somehow, human ingenuity can locate or create something that transcends natural limits. The Fountain of Youth stopped being a literal spring and became a metaphor, but the obsession driving its pursuit remained as powerful as ever. And in certain places, the legend never became metaphorical at all. Remote springs still attract believers, isolated communities still guard stories of restorative waters, and people still disappear while searching for something their rational minds insist cannot exist, but their desperate hearts refuse to abandon. The August heat of 1948 hung heavy over the waters off Bimini, where the turquoise shallows of the Bahamas give way to depths that have kept their secrets for millennia. In that summer month, 6 people sailed into those waters carrying the dreams of science, the whispers of psychic vision, and equipment that represented more money than most research expeditions could hope to see in a decade. They were looking for proof of something that lived in the space between archaeology and faith, between rational inquiry and mystical revelation. They never came back. Dr. Marcus Bellamy was not a man given to flights of fancy. His colleagues at Johns Hopkins University knew him as meticulous, perhaps even overly cautious in his conclusions. At 42 years old, he had built a reputation in anthropological circles as someone who let the evidence speak, who refused to theorize beyond what the data would support. His papers on Caribbean indigenous cultures were models of scholarly restraint, which is why, when word spread that Bellamy was organizing an expedition based on the psychic readings of Edgar Cayce, the reaction in academic circles ranged from confusion to concern. Some wondered if he had suffered some kind of breakdown. Others whispered about the money behind the expedition and speculated that even the most principled scientist might bend under the weight of truly substantial funding. The money was substantial, very substantial. The primary backer was Harold Winslow, a Philadelphia industrialist whose factories had profited enormously from wartime production. Winslow had been a devoted follower of Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet, who claimed that while in trance states, he could access universal consciousness and divine everything from medical diagnoses to the location of Atlantis. Cayce had been specific about Bimini. In reading after reading, he described an ancient Atlantean temple complex, submerged off the island's coast, complete with healing springs whose waters possessed properties that modern science had yet to understand. He predicted that evidence of this civilization would begin to emerge in 1968 or 69, but he suggested that those who knew where to look might find traces earlier. Winslow believed, and Winslow had the money to make belief actionable. He offered Bellamy a budget that would have made any university department weep with envy. What convinced Bellamy to take the money and the risk to his reputation remains a matter of speculation. His daughter, Rebecca Bellamy Fletcher, now in her late 70s, still struggles with that question. In interviews, she describes a father who had become quietly obsessed with certain anomalies in the archaeological record of the Caribbean. Perhaps, she suggests, Cayce's visions offered a framework, however unlikely, to pursue questions that conventional funding would never support. Or perhaps, like many men who survived the war years in positions of comfort while others died, he was looking for something transcendent, something that would justify the arbitrary luck that let him live while so many others fell. The team Bellamy assembled was not a collection of fringe believers. This detail matters because it underscores just how legitimate the expedition appeared. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geologist from Columbia University, specialized in underwater rock formations and had published widely respected papers on Caribbean limestone structures. Thomas Reeves and David Kowalski were both Navy-trained divers who had worked on experimental underwater breathing apparatus during the war. Margaret St. Clair was a medical doctor with a background in biochemistry, recruited specifically to analyze any water samples for unusual chemical properties. James Dutton served as the expedition photographer, a veteran of National Geographic assignments who brought both still and motion picture equipment. The sixth member was Paulo Fernandez, a local Bahamian guide whose family had fished the waters around Bimini for 5 generations and who knew the reef systems and currents with an intimacy no outsider could match. They departed from Miami on August 7, 1948, aboard a refurbished Coast Guard patrol boat that Winslow had purchased and equipped with the latest radio equipment, diving apparatus, and laboratory facilities. Witnesses at the dock described a crew that seemed in good spirits, professional, prepared. There was no sense of foreboding, no dramatic premonition. Just 6 people and their leader, heading out to pursue what might be a breakthrough or might be an expensive dead end. For the first week, their radio transmissions were routine. They established a base camp on Bimini Expedition. They conducted initial surveys of the waters Cayce had described. The messages were technical, measured, the kind of daily updates any research expedition might send. Bellamy noted limestone formations that warranted closer investigation. Chen mentioned some unusual erosion patterns. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing to suggest what was coming. The last transmission came in the early evening of August 14. The Coast Guard operator who received it, a man named Donald Cressy, recorded it in the log and later testified to its contents during the investigation. Bellamy's voice was described as excited but not panicked, animated in a way that suggested discovery rather than distress. He reported that the team had found extensive underwater rock formations arranged in patterns that appeared too regular to be entirely natural. They had found a spring, or what seemed to be a spring, where water emerged from the limestone with unusual clarity. The crew had tested it, carefully, just small amounts. Bellamy's exact words, according to Cressy's log, were, "The water burned the throat, but cleared the mind in a way I have never experienced. We are collecting samples. We are documenting everything. This is beyond what we hoped." They were told to report again in 12 hours. They never did. When the scheduled transmission time came, and went with only silence, the Coast Guard initially was not alarmed. Radio equipment failed. Batteries died. But by the following evening, with still no word, a search was launched. The patrol boat that found them on August 17th discovered something that raised more questions than it answered. The expedition's vessel was anchored in calm water about 3 miles off the Bimini coast, in an area where the ocean floor drops away into deeper channels. The boat itself was intact, undamaged. The engines were off but functional. All supplies were present and properly stored. The diving equipment was neatly organized. Personal effects, wallets, photographs, letters from home, all remained in the crew quarters exactly where one would expect them to be. The laboratory equipment showed signs of recent use. There were water samples in sealed containers, carefully labeled in what appeared to be Chen's handwriting. But the people were gone. All 7 of them simply absent. The detail that haunted the Coast Guard searchers, that still haunts the descendants and researchers who study this case, was the condition of Bellamy's journal. The leather-bound notebook was found on the chart table, open to eye. The entries were detailed, technical, describing the underwater formations with scientific precision. Chen had contributed geological observations. St. Clair had added notes about the chemical composition of the water samples, mentioning elevated concentrations of minerals she wanted to analyze more thoroughly. And then, in Bellamy's careful handwriting, the journal simply stopped mid-sentence. The last line read, "The water shows us what we truly," and nothing more. Not a trailing off, not a smudge suggesting his hand was pulled away. Just a sentence that ended as if the next word had been erased from possibility itself. The search expanded. Coast Guard cutters combed the waters. Navy divers went down to investigate the formations Bellamy had described. They found limestone structures, yes, but nothing that could not be explained by natural processes, by the patient work of waves and currents over geological time. They found the spring, or at least a place where water seemed to emerge from the rock, but samples collected showed nothing extraordinary. Elevated mineral content, certainly, but nothing that would burn the throat or clear the mind or justify the wonder in Bellamy's last transmission. No bodies were ever recovered. Not one. The ocean around Bimini is not particularly treacherous. The currents are well understood. If 7 people had drowned, even in some sudden catastrophe, the sea gives up its dead. But the ocean kept whatever it knew. Rebecca Bellamy Fletcher was 8 years old when her father disappeared. She remembers the men who came to the house, the careful way they explained that her father was missing, but that hope remained. She remembers when hope was officially abandoned and her father was declared legally dead. She remembers, most vividly, the years of wondering. In her home now, in a suburb of Baltimore, she keeps what little came back. A few personal effects from the boat, some letters, and a copy of that final journal entry. She has read those last words so many times that she says they have lost their meaning, become just shapes on paper. The water shows us what we truly. What? What were they about to become? What did they see? The story might have faded into the catalog of maritime mysteries, another tragic disappearance in waters that have claimed countless vessels and crews. But in 1973, 25 years after the expedition vanished, a commercial diver working a salvage operation in deeper water off Bimini found something wedged in a coral formation. It was a camera, badly corroded, but with film still inside. The make and model matched the equipment inventory from Dutton's photographic gear. The film was damaged, badly. Experts at Kodak worked carefully to recover what images they could. Most frames were destroyed by saltwater and time. But 3 photographs were salvageable, at least partially. They showed underwater structures, stones arranged in what appeared to be walls or foundations, patterns that the human eye wants to see as intentional. Geologists who examined the photographs were divided. Some insisted the formations were natural, examples of beach rock or fractured limestone. Others admitted they had questions, anomalies in the arrangement that were difficult to explain through natural processes alone. The debate continues. The photographs are not clear enough to be definitive. They prove nothing, except that James Dutton was down there, in the water, photographing something he thought worth documenting. What he saw, what they all saw, remains in that space between evidence and interpretation. Divers still explore the waters off Bimini. Some go looking for those formations, hoping to see what Bellamy's team saw. Some claim to have found springs where the water tastes different, feels different. The legend of Atlantis and the prophecies of Edgar Cayce draw seekers to those islands, people hungry for mystery in a world that seems to have mapped and measured everything. But 7 people went into that water with scientific instruments and careful methodology, and they never came back. The ocean kept them. And somewhere in the depths, perhaps there is still a spring where water emerges from ancient stone, water that burns the throat and shows you what you truly are. Whether that revelation is worth the price remains a question that only the missing can answer. In the spring of 1967, deep within the corridors of Brazil's military intelligence headquarters in Brasilia, a decision was made that would lead to one of the most disturbing disappearances in South American military history. The directive came from the highest levels of the government, signed by officials whose names would later be redacted from every public record. Their mission was straightforward on paper: investigate persistent indigenous reports of what local tribes called the Water of Life, a legendary spring hidden somewhere in the unexplored Amazon basin near the Venezuelan border, where the jungle grows so thick that satellite imagery showed nothing but an endless green canopy stretching to the horizon. Captain Rodrigo Tavares received his orders on a humid April morning. At 38 years old, Tavares was considered one of the military's most reliable officers, a decorated veteran of Border Patrol operations who had spent more time in the Amazon than most indigenous guides. He was methodical, rational, and utterly skeptical of anything that smacked of superstition or folklore. Those who knew him described a man who trusted only what he could measure and document. He was precisely the kind of officer you would send on a mission that sounded like fantasy, but required the discipline of military precision. The expedition was equipped with unprecedented resources for an exploratory mission. 12 soldiers were carefully selected, each one a specialist in jungle survival, each one tested for psychological stability and physical endurance. They were given 3 months of supplies, carefully calculated rations that included preserved foods, water purification tablets, and emergency medical provisions. More significantly, they carried satellite communication equipment that represented cutting-edge technology for the era, devices that would allow them to maintain daily contact with command headquarters, equipment that cost more than most rural villages would see in a decade. The expedition departed on May 3, 1967, from a small military outpost on the Rio Negro. Indigenous guides led them to the edge of what locals called the Zone of Forgetting, a region where even the most experienced trackers refused to venture. The guides spoke in hushed voices about previous expeditions that had ventured into those depths, stories of men who walked into that green darkness and simply ceased to exist. When Tavares pressed them for specifics, they offered only warnings wrapped in metaphor and myth. The water of life, they explained, was not meant for those who sought it with impure intentions. It was a gift from the old gods, the ones who ruled before the Spanish came, before the Portuguese, before the world learned the name of this jungle. For the first 2 weeks, radio transmissions from Tavares and his team arrived like clockwork. Each evening at 1800 hours, The captain would report their position, their progress, and the condition of his men. The transcripts from these early communications reveal nothing unusual, just the standard observations of soldiers pushing through difficult terrain. They documented the dense vegetation, the oppressive humidity that made every breath feel like drowning, the insects that seemed to attack with coordinated malice. Tavares noted that they were making slower progress than anticipated, that the jungle here seemed almost alive in its resistance to their passage, but his tone remained professional and measured. The change began in the third week. On May 22nd, Tavares made his scheduled transmission, but the radio operator back at headquarters noticed something different in his voice. The captain reported that several of his men were experiencing unusual levels of energy, despite the grueling conditions. They were sleeping better, he said. Their chronic aches from years of military service seemed to be fading. One soldier who had suffered from a knee injury for over 2 years claimed he could suddenly run without pain. The radio operator dutifully recorded these observations, noting in the margin of the transcript that Tavares sounded almost confused by what he was reporting, as if he himself could not quite believe what he was saying. 3 days later, the transmissions took a stranger turn. Tavares reported that his men were feeling younger, not just more energetic or healthier, but younger, as if the jungle were somehow reversing the wear of years on their bodies. A sergeant who had gone gray in his 20s claimed his hair was darkening at the roots. Another soldier noticed that scars from old wounds were fading, becoming less distinct with each passing day. The captain's voice on these recordings carries a note of wonder that his colleagues back in Brasilia found deeply unsettling. This was not the skeptical, rational Tavares they knew. This was a man beginning to believe in something he could not explain. Then came the dreams. In his transmission on May 28, Tavares described how all 12 men were experiencing the same dreams at night. Not similar dreams, but identical visions that they would compare in astonished detail each morning. They dreamed of cities that predated any known civilization in South America, structures built with a precision that seemed impossible for the era they supposedly represented. Massive stepped pyramids rose from the jungle floor, covered in geometric patterns that hurt to look at too long. Plazas stretched for miles, paved with stones that reflected starlight even in their dreams. And everywhere, flowing through channels and fountains, was water that glowed with a soft blue luminescence. The transmissions became increasingly erratic after that. Some days, there was nothing but static. Other days, Tavares would call in at odd hours, his words tumbling out in a rush of excitement. He spoke of finding markers, stone pillars carved with symbols that matched exactly what they had seen in their shared dreams. The jungle itself seemed to be guiding them, he claimed, opening paths where none had existed the day before. His men reported feeling a pull, a magnetic attraction drawing them deeper into the unexplored basin. The medical officer on the team, a rational man trained in field medicine, stated for the record that he believed they were being called by something that existed beyond the normal parameters of human understanding. Command headquarters grew alarmed. On June 7th, a directive was transmitted ordering Tavares to halt his advance and prepare for extraction. The mission was to be aborted. Whatever they were experiencing, whether hallucination brought on by unknown jungle toxins or something more inexplicable, the risk was deemed too great to continue. The response they received would become one of the most analyzed transmissions in Brazilian military history. Captain Tavares acknowledged the order but requested a 48-hour extension. His voice on that recording sounds unlike anything in his previous communications. There is an ecstatic quality to it, a euphoria that borders on religious fervor. He claimed they were close, so close to the source. They could feel it now, a presence that hummed in their bones and sang in their blood. His men, he said, had never been stronger, never been more alive. The medical officer reported that physical examinations showed all 12 soldiers had the vital signs of men in their early 20s, regardless of their actual ages. They would continue forward, Tavares stated, just for 2 more days. They would document everything. They would prove what was possible. Command denied the request in unequivocal terms. Tavares did not respond to that transmission or the dozen that followed over the next 3 days. Then, on June 10th, the satellite communication equipment activated automatically. What headquarters heard was not a standard transmission, but something far more disturbing. For 14 minutes, the recording captures what sounds like celebration. voices raised in joy and laughter, speaking over each other, in Portuguese interspersed with words in languages no one at headquarters could identify. In the background, there is a sound like running water, though the acoustics suggest an enormous volume, more river than spring. Then Tavares' voice rises above the others, clear and strong. His final words would be transcribed, analyzed, and debated for decades. He claims they have found it, the source of everything, the fountain that the old ones built before the world forgot how to see truth. His men will never need to return because they have found what every human being searches for and never finds. They have found the way to step outside of time. The transmission ends with what sounds like singing, 12 voices raised in harmony, before cutting to static that would continue unbroken for the next 6 weeks. The recovery team was dispatched on June 15th, a larger force of 40 soldiers led by 2 colonels and equipped for potential combat scenarios. It took them 3 weeks to reach the coordinates of Tavares' last known position, following the trail markers and GPS data from the satellite equipment. What they found was meticulously documented in reports that would be classified for over 30 years. The camp was intact. Tents had been erected in a standard military formation. Supply crates were stacked and inventoried, and equipment was stored properly. But the food had been left to rot in the jungle heat, attracting clouds of insects and opportunistic wildlife. More disturbing was the arrangement they discovered at the center of the camp. Every personal item from all 12 soldiers had been laid out in a perfect circle around a dried-up spring. Weapons were placed with military precision, barrels all pointing toward the center. Radios, medical kits, personal photographs, letters from home, identification papers, even the boots from 12 pairs of feet, all arranged in concentric rings around a depression in the earth where water had clearly once flowed. The recovery team photographed everything. They collected samples of the soil around the spring, bagged evidence, and conducted a systematic search of the surrounding jungle in expanding radius patterns. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from the camp. No signs of struggle or violence. No indication that 12 grown men had walked in any direction whatsoever. It was as if Tavares and his soldiers had simply ceased to occupy physical space. Satellite imagery was analyzed frame by frame. The technology in 1967 was primitive compared to modern standards, but it was sufficient to track movement through jungle canopy of that density. Analysts spent months reviewing the data. The jungle surrounding the camp was impenetrable for miles in every direction, a tangle of vegetation so thick that movement through it would require machetes and enormous effort. There were no rivers close enough to explain an escape by water. No clearings where a helicopter could have landed. No possible exit route that would not have left evidence, disturbed vegetation, or heat signatures on the infrared scans. Medical records were cross-referenced and confirmed. None of the 12 men ever appeared at any military facility, civilian hospital, or border checkpoint. Their families never received contact. Their pay was never collected. Bank accounts went untouched. It was as if 12 human beings, well-trained soldiers with families and futures, had stepped out of reality itself and closed the door behind them. The area was classified as restricted territory. The official story spoke of dangerous terrain and indigenous land rights. But those who served on the recovery team carried the memory of that perfect circle of possessions, the eerie precision of items arranged by men who knew they would not be needing them anymore. Some of the recovery soldiers reported their own strange dreams in the weeks after returning, visions of blue water and cities that could not exist. These reports were also classified, buried in files that most people will never see. What happened to Captain Rodrigo Tavares and his 12 soldiers remains one of the Amazon's most carefully guarded mysteries, a story that exists in the gap between official denial and whispered testimony. The water of life, if it ever existed, has never been found again. But somewhere in the unexplored basin near the Venezuelan border, there is a dried spring surrounded by items that 12 men decided they no longer needed, arranged in a pattern that suggests purpose and ritual and a choice made collectively. Whether they found what they were seeking or were consumed by the jungle's endless capacity for taking what does not belong to it, we will likely never know. What remains is the evidence of their final act, a message written in abandoned possessions that we still struggle to read. In the spring of 1982, 8 of the world's most respected archaeologists and historians vanished without a trace in the remote Zagros Mountains of Iran, leaving behind only their passports, watches, and personal belongings arranged in an inexplicably neat stack at the entrance to a cave they should never have entered. What makes this disappearance particularly haunting is not just the mysterious circumstances of their vanishing, but the disturbing discoveries they made in the days leading up to it. Discoveries that Iranian authorities have kept sealed behind armed guards for over 4 decades. Dr. Helena Ashworth was 53 years old when she assembled her team at Oxford University in the winter of 1981. A professor of ancient Near Eastern studies with 2 decades of fieldwork experience, she had built her reputation on meticulous research and an almost supernatural ability to locate archaeological sites that others had dismissed as myth. Her colleagues described her as cautious to a fault, someone who triple-checked every detail and never took unnecessary risks. This was not a woman prone to recklessness or flights of fancy. When she announced her intention to search for the legendary springs of Tati Soleiman, many in her department were skeptical, but no one questioned her methodology or preparation. The team she assembled reflected the seriousness of the endeavor. Dr. Marcus Webb from Cambridge brought expertise in ancient Persian languages. Dr. Reza Ahmadi, an Iranian historian based in London, served as cultural liaison and translator. Dr. Sarah Chin specialized in hydrogeology and could analyze any water sources they discovered. 4 doctoral students, carefully selected for their physical stamina and academic credentials, rounded out the expedition. They were young, brilliant, and eager to make their mark. None of them would ever be seen again. The political situation in Iran made the expedition extraordinarily difficult to arrange. The revolution had occurred just 3 years earlier in 1979, and the country remained in upheaval. Western academics were viewed with deep suspicion. Yet, somehow, through Dr. Ahmadi's family connections and months of persistent negotiation, the team secured something almost unheard of at the time: official permission from the Iranian government to conduct archaeological research in a restricted military zone. The approval came with conditions. They would be accompanied at all times by a military escort of 6 soldiers led by Captain Darius Tamali, a veteran officer with extensive knowledge of the Zagros region. They would follow prescribed routes, report their location daily via radio, and under no circumstances were they to venture into areas deemed culturally sensitive by their military guides. The expedition departed from Tehran on March 15, 1982. Their destination was a remote valley in the central Zagros Mountains, accessible only by 4-wheel drive vehicles and eventually on foot. The Zagros range stretches over 1,500 kilometers from northwestern Iran to the Persian Gulf, a landscape of jagged limestone peaks, deep valleys, and hidden plateaus where ancient civilizations once flourished. It is also a region steeped in Zoroastrian tradition, the pre-Islamic religion of Persia that flourished for over 1,000 years before the Arab conquest. Fire temples, sacred sites, and legendary locations dot the landscape, many now lost or forgotten. Dr. Ashworth's research focused on a particular mystery: references in multiple ancient texts to springs associated with Tati Soleiman, which translates to the throne of Solomon. The site known by this name today, in northwestern Iran, contains impressive archaeological ruins including a Zoroastrian fire temple and a deep volcanic crater lake. But Ashworth had become convinced, through years of textual analysis, that the original Tati Soleiman, the one described in the oldest Zoroastrian writings, was actually located elsewhere, in the central Zagros region. She had found references to springs with unusual properties, water that glowed with an inner light, water that the text claimed could reverse aging and restore youth. Most academics dismiss these descriptions as purely mythological, symbolic language expressing spiritual rather than physical transformation. But Ashworth had discovered something that changed her perspective. In a fragmentary 9th century manuscript housed in the British Library, a text that had been poorly translated and largely ignored, she found a detailed description written by a Zoroastrian priest who claimed to have visited these springs. The priest described their exact location using geographical landmarks and star positions. More disturbing were his warnings. He wrote that the water did indeed possess remarkable properties, that he had witnessed its effects firsthand, but that it demanded what he called a terrible price. Those who drank from the springs, he wrote, were changed in ways that made them no longer fully human. They had to remain at the springs, he claimed, or something worse would happen to them. The text ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted or had chosen not to continue. The first 2 weeks of the expedition proceeded according to plan. Dr. Ashworth's journal entries, later recovered by Iranian authorities, described the painstaking process of matching ancient geographical descriptions to the modern landscape. They traveled through valleys where nomadic shepherds still moved their flocks, as they had for thousands of years. They passed abandoned villages, ruins of settlements that predated Islam, traces of the Sasanian Empire that ruled Persia before the Arab conquest. Captain Kamali and his soldiers maintained a professional distance, but helped navigate the difficult terrain. The expedition's daily radio reports back to Tehran were brief and technical, detailing their coordinates and next planned movements. On March 28, 1982, everything changed. Dr. Ashworth's journal entry from that day, written in handwriting that colleagues later described as noticeably shakier than her usual neat script, describes their discovery of a narrow canyon that matched the ancient descriptions almost perfectly. At the canyon's far end, they found carved symbols in the rock face, Zoroastrian religious iconography that predated the Islamic period by centuries. Below these carvings was a cave entrance, partially concealed by rockfall, but clearly artificial, shaped by human hands. And from within the cave came a faint luminescence, a pale blue-green glow visible even in daylight. That evening's radio transmission contained barely suppressed excitement. Dr. Ashworth reported that they had found what they believed to be the site. That initial exploration suggested a cave system containing water sources with unusual optical properties. She requested permission to spend several days conducting a thorough investigation. Tehran granted approval. What the radio transmission did not convey, but what Dr. Ashworth's journal makes clear, was the reaction of their military escort. Captain Kamali had become visibly agitated upon seeing the cave entrance. He told Dr. Ashworth that local people, the nomadic tribes who moved through these mountains, avoided this area entirely. He said there were stories, old stories, about people who entered caves like this and were never seen again, or worse, who came back changed. He used a word in Farsi that Dr. Ahmadi translated as something like the transformed ones, or the altered. When Dr. Ashworth pressed him for details, Captain Kamali said only that his grandmother, who came from this region, had told him as a child never to drink from water that glowed, never to enter the earth where the old gods still slept. Dr. Ashworth, in her journal, acknowledged Captain Kamali's concerns, but noted that they seemed rooted in superstition, rather than genuine danger. She pointed out that luminescent water was not unknown, that certain minerals and biological organisms could produce such effects, that there was almost certainly a rational explanation. What the journal does not say, but what becomes clear from reading between the lines, is that she had already decided to enter the cave system regardless of the warnings. This was the culmination of years of research. She was not going to turn back because of local folklore. On March 29th, the team began their descent into the cave system. Dr. Chen conducted initial water tests and found the pools to be extraordinarily pure, with an unusual mineral composition she could not immediately identify. The luminescence came from what appeared to be microorganisms in the water itself, perhaps a form of bioluminescent bacteria or algae previously unknown to science. The caves extended deeper than expected, a network of chambers and passages following an underground stream. On the walls, they found more carvings, and in several chambers, what appeared to be the remains of ancient dwelling spaces, evidence that people had once lived in these caves for extended periods. The photographs they sent back via their military escort to be developed in the nearest town show the team in good spirits, equipped with proper caving gear, lights, and safety equipment. In one image, Dr. Ashworth stands beside a pool of glowing water, her face illuminated by its eerie light, smiling with unmistakable triumph. In another, Dr. Webb examines carved inscriptions while Dr. Chen takes water samples. The final photograph, date stamped April 1st, 1982, shows the entire team together at what appears to be the entrance to a deeper chamber. They are preparing to descend further. Everyone appears healthy, excited, professional. That photograph represents the last confirmed visual evidence of the expedition, while they were still themselves. Captain Kamali and his soldiers remained at the cave entrance, as they had done during previous explorations. On April 2nd, when the team failed to emerge at the scheduled time, Kamali waited. On April 3rd, he entered the outer chambers and called out but received no response. His radio report to Tehran expressed concern, but not yet alarm. Cave exploration often took longer than planned, and radio communication did not work underground. But by April 4th, when there was still no sign of the team, Kamali requested instructions. Tehran ordered him to wait another 72 hours before mounting a search, citing the danger of premature rescue operations in cave systems. On April 7th, Kamali entered the caves with 3 of his soldiers. They followed the team's marked route through several chambers, finding their equipment staged at various points, but no people. The caves, Kamali reported, went much deeper than anyone had initially realized, with some passages requiring technical climbing. Without proper equipment and expertise, his soldiers could not proceed beyond a certain point. They called out repeatedly. Only silence answered. A nomadic shepherd named Mahmoud Hassan made the discovery that would define this mystery. On April 9th, 1982, he was moving his flock through the valley when he noticed items stacked at the cave entrance. Not scattered or dropped, but carefully arranged in a neat pile. 8 passports, 8 wristwatches, still ticking. 8 sets of jewelry, 8 wallets containing money and identification. Everything was clean, undamaged, deliberately placed. The personal effects of 8 people, arranged with what witnesses would later describe as almost ritual precision. But no bodies. No blood. No signs of violence or struggle. No tracks leading away from the cave entrance, except for the boot prints of the military escort. Captain Kamali immediately sealed the site and sent an urgent message to Tehran. Within 48 hours, military officials and government investigators arrived. They entered the caves with advanced equipment and spelunking experts. What they found in those depths has never been officially disclosed. The Iranian government's public statement said only that the cave system was extremely dangerous, that the archaeological team had apparently succumbed to unknown hazards, and that the site was being permanently sealed for public safety. But those involved in the investigation told a different story to family members and close confidants. They spoke of chambers that went impossibly deep, of water that seemed to move with purpose, of equipment found arranged in patterns that made no sense, and most disturbing, of a room deep in the earth where they found clothing, neatly folded, as though the team had undressed and continued deeper into the darkness without their garments. Within a month, the Iranian government declared the site off-limits. They built a concrete barrier across the cave entrance and posted armed guards. Those guards remained there to this day, over 40 years later, standing watch over a sealed cave in a remote valley where hardly anyone ventures. When asked why such extensive security is necessary for a dangerous cave system, officials provide vague answers about unstable geological conditions and respect for the deceased. But locals in the region tell a different story. They say the guards are not there to keep people out. They are there to keep something in. Dr. Helena Ashworth's family spent years demanding answers. The British government made diplomatic inquiries. The families of all 8 team members pushed for a proper investigation, for the recovery of remains, for closure. Iranian authorities remained adamant. The site was too dangerous, the cave system too unstable, further exploration was impossible. The case was closed. Eventually, death certificates were issued. Memorial services were held. The 8 team members were mourned, and officially at least laid to rest. But the mystery refuses to die. Satellite imagery taken in recent years shows that the guard post remains active and occupied. Thermal imaging has reportedly detected heat signatures in the sealed cave system, though this has never been confirmed. Climbers and hikers who venture into the remote Zagros valleys report sometimes seeing lights moving deep within the mountains at night. A pale blue-green glow that seems to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Nomadic shepherds still avoid the valley where the cave lies sealed. They speak in whispers of the transformed ones, those who drank from waters they should never have touched, who sought youth and immortality, and found something worse. The Zoroastrian texts that Dr. Ashworth spent years translating remain in the archives at Oxford, filled with her meticulous notes and annotation. In the margins of one passage describing the springs of youth, she had written a question: what price would be too high for eternal life? She never learned the answer, or perhaps she learned it too well, in a chamber deep beneath the Zagros Mountains where ancient waters still glow with promises that humans were never meant to accept. The cave remains sealed, the guards remain at their posts, and 8 passports and 8 watches sit in an evidence locker in Tehran, marking the moment when 8 people chose to descend into the earth, and left behind everything that proved they had ever been human. The Everglades stretch across southern Florida like a river of grass, a vast wilderness that has swallowed countless secrets over the centuries. But in the age of GPS satellites, cellular towers, and real-time digital tracking, we tell ourselves that people cannot simply vanish. We have mapped every inch of the Earth's surface. We have eyes in the sky watching at all times. The wilderness, we believe, has been tamed by technology. The disappearance of the Chen expedition in 2003 would prove that belief to be dangerously naive. Robert Chen made his fortune in the dot-com boom of the late 1990s. By the age of 32, he had sold his software company for a sum that set him up for life, and like many young millionaires before him, he found himself searching for meaning beyond the accumulation of wealth. Chen had always been fascinated by the age of exploration, particularly the Spanish conquistadors who had first mapped the coastlines of the New World. But unlike most history enthusiasts who confine their interests to books and museums, Chen wanted to experience history firsthand. He wanted to walk in the footsteps of those who had come before. His obsession centered on Juan Ponce de León, the Spanish explorer who had landed in Florida in 1513, searching for gold, glory, and according to legend, the mythical fountain of youth. Chen spent 2 years researching Ponce de León's expeditions, combing through archives in Spain, studying 16th century maps, and consulting with academic historians. He became convinced that he could retrace the conquistadors' inland route through the Everglades using a combination of historical documents and modern technology. It would be, he told his friends, a perfect marriage of past and present. In January of 2003, Chen assembled his team. He hired Dr. Margaret Holloway, a 47-year-old anthropologist from the University of Miami, who specialized in Spanish colonial history. Next came David Ramos, a 31-year-old survival expert and wilderness guide who had spent 15 years leading expeditions through some of the world's most challenging environments. The technical team consisted of twins Jennifer and James Park, 28-year-old videographers who had made their name filming extreme adventure documentaries. Finally, Chen brought aboard Thomas Whitmore, a 53-year-old geophysicist, who would operate the ground-penetrating radar equipment they hoped would reveal hidden artifacts or structures buried beneath centuries of swamp and sediment. The expedition was planned with meticulous attention to detail. Each team member carried a GPS tracking device that transmitted their location every 15 minutes to a base station in Miami. They had 3 satellite phones with fully charged backup batteries. The Park twins brought professional-grade video equipment designed to document every moment of the journey for what was planned to be a feature-length documentary. Chen had even arranged for a dedicated website where they would upload daily video blogs, allowing followers around the world to experience the expedition in real time. They entered the Everglades on February 14, 2003, departing from a launch point near Everglades City. The plan was to spend 3 weeks following what Chen believed to be Ponce de León's original route, using historical maps as their guide while the ground-penetrating radar scanned for any anomalies that might indicate Spanish artifacts or campsites. The first 8 days went exactly according to plan. Video footage from this period shows a team in high spirits, navigating through sawgrass marshes and mangrove forests, their faces sunburned but smiling. Dr. Holloway provided historical commentary for the camera. Ramos demonstrated survival techniques. Chen himself appeared frequently in the footage, his enthusiasm infectious as he spoke about his dreams of connecting with the past. On day 8, their video blog showed the team making camp on a small hammock island, a slightly elevated area of dry ground surrounded by swamp. Whitmore's ground-penetrating radar had detected what he called an interesting anomaly about 2 miles ahead, a regular geometric pattern that seemed out of place in the natural landscape. The team was excited. Chen spoke to the camera that evening, his face illuminated by firelight, explaining that they would investigate the anomaly the following morning. The footage shows all 5 team members looking healthy, their equipment functioning normally, the mood optimistic. The final transmission came at 8:47 on the morning of February 23rd. It was a routine GPS ping, showing the team had traveled approximately 1.3 miles from their campsite, presumably heading toward the anomaly Whitmore had detected. Then, at 9:03, all 5 GPS signals vanished simultaneously. The backup systems, the redundant devices, the satellite phones, everything went dark at exactly the same moment. At first, the monitoring team in Miami assumed it was a technical glitch. GPS signals sometimes fail in dense foliage. Satellite phones can lose connection. But as hours stretched into a full day with no contact, concern turned to alarm. By the evening of February 24th, a search and rescue operation was launched. The last known coordinates put the team deep in one of the most isolated sections of the Everglades, but it was not an impossible location to reach. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the search area. Airboats carrying experienced Everglades guides navigated the waterways. Bloodhounds were brought in to track scents. The Chen family, desperate for answers, offered substantial rewards for information. On February 27th, 4 days after the disappearance, searchers found the campsite. It was located on the hammock island visible in the last video blog, and everything appeared untouched. The tents were still standing. Sleeping bags remained laid out. Food supplies were properly stored. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of violence or animal predation. But most disturbingly, the video equipment was still running. The cameras were still recording, their batteries somehow not depleted despite days of continuous operation. The footage recovered from those cameras would become one of the most analyzed and debated pieces of evidence in modern missing persons history. For the first portion, the recording showed exactly what you would expect: the empty campsite, swaying trees, the ambient sounds of the Everglades. The time code on the cameras showed continuous recording from the morning of February 23rd onward. But at random intervals, the footage would dissolve into static bursts of white noise that lasted anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes. Technical experts initially assumed this indicated a malfunction or data corruption. Then investigators began examining the static sequences frame by frame. Hidden within the interference, appearing for no more than a handful of frames at a time, were images of the 5 team members. But these were not images of the healthy, middle-aged explorers who had entered the Everglades 2 weeks earlier. The figures in these fragmentary frames appeared decades older. Chen's dark hair had gone completely white. Dr. Holloway looked gaunt and ancient, her face lined with wrinkles far beyond what her actual age should show. The Park twins, who had been 28 years old, appeared elderly. Their clothes hung in tatters, weather-beaten and deteriorated as if they had been worn for years rather than days. Most disturbing of all was their behavior in these brief glimpses. They were not moving. They simply stood there, facing the cameras directly, staring into the lenses with expressions that forensic psychologists later described as haunted, resigned, aware. In one frame, Chen appeared to be holding up his hands as if trying to communicate something, but the image dissolved back into static before any meaning could be discerned. In another sequence, Dr. Holloway's mouth was open as if she were speaking or screaming, but no audio accompanied the visual. The footage was immediately suspected to be a hoax, perhaps an elaborate publicity stunt or artistic project. But analysis told a different story. The cameras themselves were examined by experts from multiple independent laboratories. The storage media showed no evidence of tampering or post-production editing. The file metadata was consistent with continuous recording from a single session. The timecode had not been altered or manipulated. Most significantly, forensic video analysts confirmed that the images of the aged team members were not created using digital effects, prosthetics, or makeup. The degradation of their physical appearance, the changes in skin texture, the genuine signs of biological aging, none of this could be convincingly faked with the technology readily available in 23. Further analysis only deepened the mystery. Computer enhancement of the deteriorated clothing revealed details that should not have been present. The fabric showed wear patterns consistent with years of exposure to sun, moisture, and vegetation. Microscopic examination detected pollen grains from plant species that, while present in the Everglades, bloom at different times of year. One sample contained pollen from a plant that flowers only in autumn. 8 months after the expedition's February departure. Another showed degradation from prolonged UV exposure, far exceeding what 9 days in the field could produce. The search for the Chen expedition continued for months. The family hired private investigators, psychics, remote viewers, anyone who might provide answers. Searchers covered hundreds of square miles of the Everglades, finding nothing. No bodies, no additional equipment, no trace of the 5 people who had simply ceased to exist on that February morning. The case officially remained open, classified as a missing persons investigation, but as years passed without any new evidence, it faded from public attention. The Chen family never stopped searching. Robert Chen's parents, both successful professionals who had emigrated from Taiwan to build a life in America, could not accept that their son had vanished without explanation. They established a foundation dedicated to funding continued search efforts and investigating similar cases of unexplained disappearances. The reward for information leading to the discovery of the team members, or conclusive evidence of their fate, currently stands at $1 million. It has never been claimed. What happened on that 9th day in the Everglades remains unknown. The official investigation could offer no satisfying explanation for the simultaneous failure of multiple GPS devices and communication systems. Equipment redundancy existed precisely to prevent such a scenario. Weather records for that date show clear skies, normal temperatures, no atmospheric disturbances that might interfere with satellite signals. The devices themselves, when eventually recovered, showed no damage or malfunction. They had simply stopped transmitting at 9:03 in the morning of February 23rd. The video evidence defies conventional explanation. If we accept that the footage is genuine and unmanipulated, which multiple independent analyses support, then we are left with images of 5 people who somehow aged decades in a matter of days or hours. We see them standing in their own campsite, staring at cameras they themselves had set up, but appearing as if they had lived an entire lifetime in the span of a single morning. Some researchers have proposed theories involving time dilation, suggesting the team somehow encountered a localized temporal anomaly. Others point to the Fountain of Youth legend that had inspired Chen's expedition in the first place, wondering if perhaps he found something in those swamps after all, something that twisted the normal flow of time in ways we cannot comprehend. The Everglades keep their secrets well. In a world of constant surveillance, satellite tracking, and digital connectivity, 5 people walked into that wilderness and disappeared as completely as if they had stepped through a door into another dimension. The case remains open, the mystery unsolved, and somewhere in that vast expanse of sawgrass and dark water, the truth of what happened to Robert Chen and his team waits to be discovered. The winter of 2019 was one of the coldest on record in the Sakha Republic of Siberia, a place already known as one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Temperatures plummeted to -60 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that turns exposed skin black with frostbite in minutes, where your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth and falls to the ground as crystals. This is the land of permafrost, where the ground has been frozen solid for thousands of years, where nothing should grow and where nothing warm should exist. Yet it was into this frozen hell that Dr. Yuri Volkov led his 6-person geological survey team in late January of that year, following up on persistent reports from indigenous Sakha hunters about something that should not exist, a spring that never froze. Dr. Volkov was no amateur. At 53 years old, he had spent 3 decades studying Arctic geological formations for Moscow State University. He had published over 40 peer-reviewed papers on permafrost dynamics and had survived more Siberian expeditions than most researchers would attempt in a lifetime. His team was equally qualified, each member hand-picked for their expertise and their experience in extreme environments. They had full government support, satellite phones, emergency beacons, state-of-the-art cold weather gear, and enough supplies to last 6 weeks if necessary. Everything about this expedition was legitimate, sanctioned, and thoroughly planned. This was climate research at its most professional level, investigating what they assumed would be a geothermal anomaly with potential implications for understanding climate change, impacts on Arctic permafrost stability. The reports that drew them into the wilderness came from multiple independent sources over the course of several years. Sakha hunters, Men who had lived their entire lives in these frozen wastes spoke of a place deep in the taiga where steam rose from the ground, even in the darkest, coldest days of winter. They described it with unease, often making protective gestures when discussing it. The old ones among them called it cursed, a place where the spirits were confused, neither of the frozen world above nor the warm world below. But to modern scientists, it suggested a geothermal vent, perhaps connected to the volcanic activity that occasionally rumbles through the region. Such a discovery would be scientifically valuable, offering insights into heat flow through permafrost, and potentially harboring unique thermophilic organisms, adapted to survive in this isolated hotspot. The team established base camp on January 23rd, approximately 3 kilometers from the reported location of the spring. Their daily radio check-ins were professional and routine for the first 4 days, as they conducted preliminary surveys, took soil samples, and used ground-penetrating radar to map subsurface thermal patterns. Volkov's reports indicated they were narrowing in on the source of the anomaly. On January 27th, they made contact with the spring itself. The excitement in Volkov's voice during that evening's radio transmission was palpable. He described finding a clearing in the dense taiga, roughly 30 meters in diameter, where the temperature was inexplicably above freezing, despite the ambient air temperature hovering at -55 degrees. At the center was a pool of steaming water, perhaps 5 meters across, surrounded by vegetation that had no business existing this far north, and certainly not in January. He described lush green grass, moss, small flowering plants, even insects moving sluggishly in the relatively warmer air. When they tested the water temperature, their thermometers registered 105 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than human body temperature, emerging from solid permafrost that should have been frozen meters deep. The team spent the next day conducting intensive studies of the site. Volkov's reports grew increasingly detailed and increasingly puzzled. The water chemistry was unusual, but not impossible. What was impossible was the geological context. There was no volcanic activity in the immediate area, no fault lines that should allow geothermal water to reach the surface at this temperature. The permafrost surrounding the spring was ancient, undisturbed, showing no signs of the kind of geological features that should accompany such a thermal anomaly. It was as if the spring had simply appeared, punched through frozen ground that should have been impermeable, bringing warmth and life to a place designed for death. On January 29th, Volkov reported that team members were spending extended periods near the spring, taking samples directly from the source. He mentioned almost casually that they had all noticed feeling more energized, less affected by the brutal cold. He attributed this to the localized warmth and perhaps psychological excitement over their discovery. His voice on that transmission was animated, almost euphoric. He spoke of career-defining research, of discoveries that would reshape their understanding of Arctic systems. The transmission on January 30th began normally enough. Volkov reported that they were packing up equipment and preparing to return to base camp with their samples. Then, halfway through the check-in, his tone changed. He stopped mid-sentence, and when he resumed speaking, the professionalism was gone, replaced by something raw and frightened. He said that team members were not responding normally to his instructions. His exact words, preserved in the radio logs, were chilling. Something is wrong with their faces. They look younger. Mikhail's gray hair, it's turning dark. Svetlana's wrinkles are disappearing. The radio operator in Yakutsk tried to clarify, to confirm what he was hearing, but Volkov continued speaking rapidly, his voice rising in pitch. He described his team members acting strangely, moving differently, their voices changing. He used the word changing repeatedly. The other team members could be heard in the background, not speaking words but making sounds described later by those who heard the recordings as disturbingly childlike, somewhere between laughter and crying. Then Volkov's voice became desperate, pleading. "They are becoming children," he said. "Get us out. Send extraction now. Do not come near the spring. Whatever is in the water, it is changing us." The transmission ended abruptly. Subsequent attempts to raise the team on the radio went unanswered. A rescue operation was launched immediately, but the logistics of extracting a team from that remote location in those conditions meant it took 4 days to reach the site. When rescuers finally arrived on February 3rd, what they found defied rational explanation and haunts everyone involved to this day. The base camp was destroyed. Tents had been torn down from the inside, fabric ripped and shredded. Equipment was smashed, not with tools but apparently with repeated blunt force, as if someone had battered sensitive scientific instruments against rocks and trees. Supplies were scattered, some equipment partially buried in snow, some thrown into the surrounding forest. But there was no fire damage, no sign of attack from animals or people, no rational explanation for the systematic destruction. The investigation team found evidence of violence, though the nature of that violence was ambiguous. Frozen bloodstains marked the snow in several locations, not pooled as from a fatal injury but scattered, as if from nosebleeds or minor wounds sustained during a struggle. Torn clothing was discovered, adult-sized cold weather gear ripped apart and discarded. But most disturbing were the footprints, leading away from the destroyed camp, heading deeper into the taiga in 5 separate directions, were sets of small footprints, the size and depth consistent with children between the ages of 10 and 15. The prints were made by bare feet, impossibly, given the temperature. They could be tracked for several hundred meters before they vanished into terrain too frozen and wind-scoured to hold impressions. 5 sets. 5 missing team members. The rescue team secured the scene and began documentation. That is when they found Dr. Volkov. His body was in the spring itself, submerged in the steaming water, frozen in a seated position against the rocky edge of the pool. His eyes were open, his mouth slightly ajar, and every person who saw his face reported the same unsettling detail. His expression appeared to show both extreme agony and profound ecstasy, a contradiction that made looking at him deeply uncomfortable. They extracted his body with difficulty and arranged for transport to Yakutsk for autopsy. When pathologists examined Volkov's remains, they found something that should have been medically impossible. Every cellular marker they tested suggested a biological age of approximately 15 years old. His skin showed the collagen density and elasticity of an adolescent. His organs displayed minimal age-related degradation. His bones showed growth plate characteristics of someone not yet finished with puberty. Yet dental records and DNA testing confirmed unequivocally that this was the body of Yuri Volkov, who had been 53 years old when he left for the expedition. The DNA testing also confirmed something equally impossible. The footprints in the snow, 5 sets of small, childlike impressions, contained skin cells and trace biological material that matched the 5 missing team members. Adults in their 30s, 40s, and 50s had apparently transformed into children and fled barefoot into the Siberian winter, where no one could survive more than minutes without protection. No bodies were ever recovered. Extensive search operations continued for weeks, covering hundreds of square kilometers, using helicopters, drones, and teams on snowmobiles. They found nothing. No remains, no clothing, no evidence of what happened to the 5 team members whose footprints led away from camp. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist after walking into the wilderness. The spring itself has been studied extensively since the incident. Water samples show unusual, but not impossible chemical compositions. The temperature remains consistent at 105 degrees. The vegetation continues to thrive in its microclimate, and the geological anomaly remains unexplained but not paranormal, according to official reports. Teams have returned repeatedly, taking every precaution, and nothing unusual has occurred. Whatever happened to the Volkov expedition, whatever force caused biological regression in mature adults, has either gone dormant or manifests only under specific conditions we do not understand. The official explanation, if it can be called that, suggests mass psychosis triggered by isolation and extreme conditions, combined with a coincidental geothermal event and misidentification of evidence. But this explanation crumbles under the weight of physical evidence. You cannot explain away DNA-confirmed footprints. You cannot rationalize the biological age markers found in Volkov's tissues. You cannot account for the systematic transformation described in his final transmission with psychological terminology alone. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that it happened in our time, with modern equipment, extensive documentation, and professional scientists. This was not a poorly documented event from the 1900s or an anecdotal story passed down through generations. Every aspect was recorded, photographed, analyzed by multiple independent agencies. And still, we have no answers that make sense. The Volkov case forces us to confront the possibility that there are processes in nature we do not understand, phenomena that can alter human biology in ways our science says should be impossible. What was in that spring? What mechanism could reverse decades of aging in hours or days? And perhaps, most terrifying, where are the 5 team members who walked away as children into the frozen wilderness? Did they die quickly in the cold? Their small bodies lost forever under snow and ice? Or does something worse wait in the depths of the Siberian taiga, something that takes away not just your life, but your very identity, reducing experienced adults to helpless children and releasing them into an environment where they cannot survive? The spring still flows. The vegetation still grows in its impossible garden. And somewhere in Moscow, sealed files contain recordings of Dr. Yuri Volkov's final transmission, his voice breaking as he begs for help while his team transforms around him, their adult voices becoming the cries of children lost in a place where nothing warm should exist. When 5 separate expeditions vanish across different continents over the span of nearly 3 decades, it might be dismissed as tragic coincidence. When each team was composed of experienced professionals equipped with modern technology and comprehensive safety protocols, the disappearances become troubling. But when investigators discover that every single expedition reported finding unusual water sources days before their communication ceased, we are forced to confront something far more disturbing than mere coincidence. The pattern emerges, like a photograph developing in chemical solution, details appearing where none seemed to exist before. The Henderson team in the Atacama Desert, 2004. The Volkov expedition in Siberia, 2009. The Malaysian disappearance, 2012. The Iranian cave expedition, 2015. The Australian interior vanishing, 2019. 5 expeditions, 5 disappearances, and running through each investigation like a thread of ice water, the same impossible elements repeating. Every team reported discovering water in places where water should not exist. Henderson's final transmission mentioned pools in desert caves that tested purer than laboratory distilled water. Volkov's last sample showed mineral compositions that geologists at Moscow State University classified as unknown to existing databases. The Malaysian team's photographs captured streams flowing upward against gravity before their satellite phone went silent. In each case, the water itself seemed to defy natural law. Then there are the biological impossibilities. The DNA results from samples recovered at 3 of the sites remain locked in laboratory vaults because no peer-reviewed journal will publish findings that contradict every established principle of genetics and aging. Cells from water samples near the Siberian site showed telomere lengthening, the cellular markers of aging running backward. Blood traces found at the Australian location contained red blood cells with a lifespan that exceeded human physiological limits by orders of magnitude. One researcher, speaking only on condition of anonymity, described the findings as showing human tissue that was simultaneously dying and regenerating at the cellular level, a biological paradox that should not be possible. The temporal anomalies prove equally unsettling. Equipment recovered from the Henderson site included digital watches that had lost exactly 17 hours, though their internal batteries showed no corresponding power drain. The Iranian cave, now sealed and under permanent military guard, contains camping equipment with carbon dating results that suggest the materials aged decades in the span of days. Investigators found journals with entries dated in sequence, handwriting consistent throughout, but forensic analysis of the ink showing oxidation patterns, spanning years rather than weeks. Indigenous peoples living near each disappearance site had offered warnings that went unheeded. The Atacama locals spoke of waters that lived in stone, gift givers who demanded everything in return. Siberian Evenki hunters refused to approach certain valleys, telling stories passed down through generations about pools that made elders young again, but stole their shadows, left them hollow. Malaysian tribes near the vanishing point maintained taboos about certain jungle streams, waters they called the thief's blessing. Australian Aboriginal communities had dreaming stories about waterholes that existed outside of time, places where the ancestors went to become unborn. The consistency of these warnings across cultures, with no contact with each other, raises questions that modern anthropology struggles to address. Each tradition spoke of waters that give with one hand and take everything with the other. Each described those who drank or bathed returning, changed younger in appearance, but fundamentally diminished, as though some essential element of their humanity had been extracted as payment. The warnings were dismissed as superstition by every expedition that vanished. Geologists have proposed theories involving unknown mineral compounds, elements not yet identified by standard analysis that might create unusual electromagnetic fields or chemical reactions. Some suggest rare earth deposits creating localized phenomena, natural reactors of sorts producing effects that mimic but do not actually represent time distortion. Yet these theories fail to explain why samples transported to laboratories lose their anomalous properties within hours, as if whatever made them impossible cannot survive outside specific geographical location. Biologists working with extremophile organisms have documented bacteria and microorganisms that survive in conditions once thought incompatible with life. Some researchers speculate that undiscovered extremophiles might produce compounds with age-reversing properties, cellular mechanisms that evolved in isolated environments under unique pressures. But extremophiles do not explain the temporal equipment failures, the photographs that show things cameras should not capture, the sealed cave in Iran that 3 governments have agreed must never be opened. Physicists have entertained the most unsettling possibilities. Localized time distortions, pockets where the normal flow of causality becomes unstable due to gravitational anomalies or quantum fluctuations at macro scale. Theoretical models exist for such phenomena, though always at scales or energies far beyond what should occur naturally on Earth's surface. If these sites somehow generate stable temporal distortions, the implications extend far beyond 5 missing expeditions. They suggest our understanding of physical law contains fundamental gaps. What terrifies investigators most is not the disappearances themselves, but what remains. The authenticated photographs that analysis confirms are unaltered, showing team members who appear decades younger than images taken weeks earlier. The impossible DNA sequencing that sits in locked files because publishing would destroy careers. The Iranian cave, now surrounded by fencing and armed guards, from which sounds are occasionally reported. Voices speaking in languages the missing expedition members never knew. Despite official closures, despite warnings from governments and scientific institutions, the rumors persist. At least 7 new private expeditions are currently believed to be in planning stages, funded by wealthy individuals who see in these disappearances not cautionary tales, but treasure maps. Some seek the fountain of youth itself. Others hope to unlock commercial applications, pharmaceuticals that might reverse aging. A few, perhaps, are drawn by the mystery itself, unable to accept that questions might remain forever unanswered. We may soon have a 6th disappearance to document, and a 7th, and an 8th, because the pattern teaches us something about human nature that perhaps we already knew. We cannot resist the forbidden. We will always believe ourselves different from those who came before, smarter, better prepared, immune to whatever fate claimed the others. And perhaps that certainty, that conviction that we alone will succeed where others failed, is itself part of the trap. If the fountain of youth exists, if these 5 expeditions actually found what humanity has sought for millennia, then perhaps the real horror is not that they disappeared, but that they got exactly what they were searching for. Perhaps they are still at those sites, drinking waters that run backward through time, growing younger while something essential drains away, caught in a cycle that gives eternal youth while extracting the very thing that makes youth worth having. Perhaps the indigenous warnings were precisely accurate, and the price of the gift is everything that makes us human. The question that haunts every investigator, every family member still hoping for answers, every researcher studying the impossible evidence, is simple and terrible. If you could live forever, stay young indefinitely, but the cost was everything you are beyond your physical body, would you pay it? And more frightening still, would you even know you had made that choice? Or would the waters simply take what they wanted while you drank, grateful and doomed from their impossible depths? Pataway, shine. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.